Mr. Speaker, this afternoon I will cast my vote to approve the President's funding to train and equip the moderate Syrian opposition forces. I do so after long consideration and mindful of the difficulties of vetting such a force during the middle of a brutal civil war. Any decision to supply arms to combatants must be weighed carefully. Indeed, for the last several years, I've opposed arming the Syrian rebels out of a concern for our ability to properly vet such troops and the fear that weapons we provide may end up in the wrong hands. Those concerns persist, but they have been overcome by the growing menace of ISIL and the willingness of our regional allies to play a greater and open role in the support of these forces.
I warned a year ago that involving us in Syria's civil war was a mistake, that the inescapable irony is that someday the arms we supply would be used against us or Israel. That day's now. ISIS has grabbed up from the U.S., from the Saudis, from the Qataris, weapons by the truckload. And we are now forced to fight against our own weapons, and this body wants to throw more weapons into the mix. The New York Times also reports that there were huge arms and financial transfers from Qatar to the Syrian rebels, beginning as early as 3 years ago. No one really knows where all of this is going to end up, where these arms are going to wind up. Jane's Terrorism Center noted that the transfer of Qatari weapons to targeted groups has the same practical effect of transferring the weapons to al-Nusra, a violent jihadist group. Let me repeat that. Jane's defense analyst says that if you give the weapons to the so-called moderate rebels, it's the same as giving it to al-Nusra. The New York Times further detailed that even Sudan has been sending anti-tank missiles and other arms to Syria. Hard to argue there's not enough weapons floating around over there. So the idea that these rebels haven't been armed really is ludicrous. It's also ludicrous to believe that we know where all the money and all the arms and all the ammunition will wind up, or who will wind up benefiting from these arms. Why? Because we don't even know who all these groups are. Even if we think we do, the loyalties shift on a daily basis. The groups have become amorphous, with alleged moderates lining up side by side with jihadists. Not to mention that, guess what? Some of these people don't tell the truth. And finally, moderates have been now found to sell their weapons. In fact, there's accusations by the family of Steve Sotloff, who was recently killed by the barbarians. There are accusations that he was sold by moderate rebels to the jihadists. Remember clearly that the president and his Republican allies have been clamoring for over a year for airstrikes against Assad. Assad was our enemy last year. This year, he's our friend. Had all those airstrikes, though, occurred last year in Syria, today ISIS might be in Damascus. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. We gave 600 tons of weapons to the rebels, and they got weaker and weaker, and ISIS grew stronger. Perhaps by throwing all of these weapons into the civil war, we actually degraded Assad's ability to counter them. So perhaps Assad might well have taken care of the radical jihadists, and he can't because of the weapons. Perhaps we've created a safe haven. The other night, the president said in his speech, he said that it will be a policy of his administration to leave no safe haven for anyone who threatens America. Sounds good, except for the last 3 years, we've been creating a safe haven for ISIS. ISIS has grown stronger because we've been arming the resistance that ISIS is part of. Many former officials are very forthright with their criticism. According to the former ambassador to Iraq and Syria, our ambassador, he says, we need to do everything we can to figure out who the non-ISIS opposition is, because frankly, we don't have a clue. Think about this. We are voting or obscuring the vote in a spending bill to send $500 million worth of arms to Syria, to people who we say are the vetted, moderate Syrian rebels. Well, guess what? One of the men with the most knowledge on the ground of this, who's been our ambassador to Iraq and Syria, says, we don't have a clue who the moderates are and who the jihadists are. And even if they tell you they are the moderates, oh, we love Thomas Jefferson. Give us a shoulder-fired missile. We love Thomas Jefferson. Can you trust these people? There are estimates that half of the Free Syrian Army has defected, many of them to al-Nusra and to al-Qaeda and to ISIS. These are the people your representatives are going to vote to send arms to. Half of them have defected. Half of them are now fighting with the jihadists. We've proven time and again that we don't know how to vet these leaders. Two groups that were initially provided U.S. aid and help last year are good examples. A top official of Ahrar al-Sham, one of the largest rebel groups at the time, announced publicly that he now considers himself to be allied with al-Qaeda. Just yesterday, our ambassador, our most recent ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, said that the moderate forces have and will tactically ally with al-Qaeda, with al-Qaeda-linked Nusra. Listen carefully. Your representatives are sending $500 million to people who will tactically ally with al-Qaeda. The interventionists clamor for boots on the ground. We should remember they were wrong about Iraq. They were wrong about Libya. They were wrong about Syria. When will we quit listening to the advocates who have been wrong about every foreign policy position of the last 2 decades? When does a track record of being consistently wrong stop you from being a so-called expert when the next crisis comes up? We should remember that they were wrong. There were no WMDs. That Hussein, Gaddafi, and Assad were not a threat to us. Doesn't make them good, but they were not a threat to us. We should remember that radical Islam now roams the countryside in Libya and in Syria and in Iraq. We should remember that those who believe that war is the answer for every problem were wrong. We should remember that the war against Hussein, the war against Gaddafi, the war against Assad has all led to chaos. That intervention enhanced the rise of radical Islam and ultimately led to more danger for Americans. You've all heard it before. Toppling Gaddafi led to a jihadist wonderland in Libya. Toppling Hussein led to chaos in Iraq that we're still involved with. Toppling Assad will lead to more chaos and greater danger to America from the jihadists.